You are most well known for the what is called the minimal facts argument. Before getting into what exactly does that, laying it out, the facts and whatnot, can you briefly explain for those of that have never heard of this, what is the minimal facts argument? What exactly is it, the claim that it makes, and how do you go about developing it?
Well, um, when I was working on my dissertation, my PhD dissertation, which was on the resurrection, was at a secular university. Still remember, I was pastoring, and I was sitting in a chair with the light over my shoulder. I remember the time, and I was trying to answer a naturalistic theory, an objection to the resurrection. And I took a sheet of paper, and I wrote down on the sheet of paper, if all we know are the things which critics are willing to admit, do I still have enough to answer this objection? And so I made a long list of responses based on criteria which were allowed by the critics, by critical scholars. I don't mean just anybody who would go off on the resurrection. I mean somebody with scholarly credentials and worked in the field. And so I made this list. And then at the bottom of the list, I made a little note, and I said, if the critics get even more critical than the ones I'm talking about, if I talk to even stronger critics, my list would shrink a little bit, but I would still have enough data to refute this theory. And that was basically the minimal facts argument. But the way I define it real briefly is like this. If we only use the data which strong critics grant. Now, what's a strong critic? A strong critic might be an atheist, agnostic, a skeptical New Testament scholar, or a person with a terminal degree, let's say PhD in New Testament, but that's not their religion. They're Jewish, or there's some other view. Or, as I said, agnostic or atheist, like Bart Ehrman or Gerrit Ludemann, the German New Testament scholar. Minimal facts says, if this book, often when I'm at a state university, I hold up a little New Testament and I'll say, if this book is the Word of God, Jesus has been raised from the dead. But if this book is not the Word of God, and it's a bunch of writings from people who think it's the Word of God, I can use the lowest common denominator kind of arguments, which critics allow because the evidence for those arguments are good. I'll have a lot more evidence, of course, if I use the whole New Testament. Mm-hmm. But if I use the critics' New Testament, like that sheet that I wrote on that chair in my living room years ago, if I use their facts, I still have enough to show that Jesus was raised from the dead. So that's the minimal facts argument. With the whole New Testament, it's easy to support the resurrection. With only the facts which critics allow, very small percentage of New Testament data, we still have enough to show that the resurrection of Jesus is the best explanation for what occurred. That's the minimal facts argument.
So basically, this is a way. I don't know if you would agree, but this is essentially establishing common ground. You're essentially saying, okay, this is the facts that you as a non-believer accept. So let's build off on those facts that you accept, and even on your grounds, nevertheless, the resurrection is true.
Right. You're calling it common ground. I sometimes call the minimal facts argument the lowest common denominator argument. Here's the full set of facts, but what if I use just this little short list of facts? If you have enough data from the facts that the atheist New Testament scholars, in other words, they're scholars, they know what the New Testament is about, and they're only going to accept a small amount of data. If you can get the resurrection from those data, well, then I would guess that would be a pretty good argument for the resurrection. So that's how it begins, yeah.
Yeah, so essentially you came up with this argument then, or is it part of a larger type of methodology that you simply applied to the resurrection?
A lot of scholars start with, a lot of critics, not evangelicals, start with, they'll write a book on the life of Jesus based on what facts we can know. But what I call the minimal facts argument myself came out of my own doubts. It was something I came up with in the sense that I was doing it again for me, because I was trying to say, if I'll use my Bible again, if all of this is true, I have a resurrection. If part of it's true, I've got kind of a good evidence. But if almost none of it is true, if the resurrection is true on this almost nothing base, see, and when I was going through my doubts, I kept thinking, well, what if it's worse than what I think? Or what if I'm too gullible and I think the fact list is smaller? And like I wrote on that back of my notes, I wrote, and what if it's smaller still? Well, there's almost nobody who will not acknowledge my short list. I only use 6 facts, and then I use part of another one. I have to explain that. But there's the most skeptical New Testament scholars in the world accept it. I've had debates with scholars where they'll say, all right, what facts are going to use? And I'll tell them this facts, and they'll say, as one said, he goes, yeah, you can have that whole list. I don't have any doubts about any of that. So that's often how the discussion starts. And if that's enough to show that Jesus was raised from the dead, well then, wow, that's a powerful event.
Okay, so what are these facts then? Now that we established that you have a minimal facts argument, you mentioned 6. I wonder if you could
let me back up and give a definition of the minimal facts.
Okay.
When I give minimal facts, I say 2 things have to be true. I will not use any fact that is not A, defended by a bunch of other data. So just to make up a little silly example, I won't use fact A if fact A doesn't have 5, 6, 7, 10, 12, sometimes 20 good reasons for saying it's true. And you say, well, yeah, because you're taking the Bible. No, the reasons I'm using, New Testament scholars who are atheists concede these arguments. So the first thing is many facts have to back up each one of them. All right. And the second argument is because the evidence is so strong, the vast majority of scholars will allow these facts. High percentage of critical scholars will allow these facts. So that's the key. Many evidences for each, and actually dozens of backup points for each of these 6. And I often call them 6 plus 1 because the 7th one, which I'll get to, has a whole lot of good evidences, and that's by far the most important. But not everybody's going to grant that one. That's the empty tomb, and about 70% of scholars thereabouts will accept the empty tomb. The other ones, though, are in the 90 percentile. And by the way, they're not true because skeptics say they're true.
Yes.
It's the other way around. Skeptics say they're true because there's many, many facts in their favor. Okay, having said that, here's the 6. Jesus died by crucifixion. Secondly, the disciples had experiences that they believed were appearances of the risen Jesus. So they believed they saw the risen Jesus. Thirdly, they preached this very, very early. And you go, well, yeah, but you need your New Testament for that, right? Okay, let me quote 2 incredible, I believe both atheists, New Testament scholars, Bart Ehrman in North America, and Gerhard Ludemann, the German. Let me take them in reverse order. Gerhard Ludemann says, there is no question that the disciples began teaching the resurrection immediately after they thought the events occurred. Immediately after. Bart Ehrman says, the earliest reports in the New Testament are not the Gospel of Mark, which is the earliest gospel, scholars think. Not even the epistles of Paul, which cut the distance in half. The earliest reports are these creedal statements that Paul learned from the people who saw these things. And Bart Ehrman says they date within 1 to 2 years after the cross. This is an atheist New Testament scholar. 1 to 2 years after the crucifixion. It was out and about. The material spread, and it was out there. James D.G. Dunn, who just passed away recently, he basically said these appearances could have been formulated in a creedal form the same year as Jesus died. So this is conceded by critics. So,
And sorry to me to interrupt. This is very critical. I just read a response by William Lane Craig regarding this very fact. And one of the critiques that he was responding to in terms of resurrection was the fact that maybe these are just legends and stuff that people made up over time. And he argues that the fact that they are so early within the first century, within the resurrection, it's not enough time for a story, a historical event, to become legend. Would that be correct?
Well, I wouldn't use that reason, and I'll tell you why. And I've told Bill Craig this before. I don't know how long ago he said that, but here's how long it takes a legend to develop. I'm talking to Manuel today, and I get off the air, and I call a friend, and I say, Manuel said, and if Manuel were there, he would say, that's not exactly what I said. I said A, and you're saying I said B. Now, I get I know you're not lying, but you kind of messed up what I said. Okay, how long does it take me to spread that false story about you? Not a false story, but a false comment. 1 hour. Well, you can get a fact messed up in 1 hour. It doesn't take a year or 5 years or 10 years. But here's how we know that legend or time doesn't account for the data. I'll go back to Bart Ehrman, atheist New Testament scholar. Bart Ehrman says these little creedal passages in the New Testament, the best example is 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 and following. And he says, Bart Ehrman says, every creedal passage in the New Testament could have come about prior to Paul's conversion. In other words, when Paul is on the way to Damascus, which is dated at 2 or 3 years after the crucifixion. So if you put the crucifixion at 30, and Paul's on the way to Damascus at 32 or 33, Ehrman says every creed that Paul records in his epistles could well have been in existence before he started out on that trip. Secondly, he says, they came from Jerusalem. Thirdly, they could have come from the disciples. Now, what backs that up is that Galatians is a book accepted by critics. I'll let you use the book of Galatians as an authentic Pauline book. Paul says in Galatians 1, 18 through 20, and in Galatians 2, 1 through 10, that he made 2 trips back to Jerusalem. Paul was a good researcher. How do you know? Well, he was a Pharisee. And Josephus, for example, Jewish historian, tells us that Pharisees taught by repetition and by learning and by repeating, just like teachers do today. Mm-hmm. So Paul was a Pharisee. He knew how to do research. And one of the ways he did research, he made 2 trips to Jerusalem. The first time, he said, I spent 15 days interviewing Peter and James, the brother of Jesus, 2 eyewitnesses. I interviewed Peter and James, the brother of Jesus. Then he made a second trip years later, but before his very first New Testament book, so still very early. He went back to Jerusalem. This time, Peter was still there, James, the brother of Jesus, was still there, and John is there. Now, what's important about this is these are what I call the big 4. These are the 4 top scholars, researchers, and I know they were fishermen and preachers, but that was scholarship in those days. Next to Paul, who was the best trained, they're the main people. And again, Paul, Peter, John, and James, the brother of Jesus, they were all there. And what are they talking about? Paul specifically said we were discussing the gospel. Well, what is the gospel? Paul defines the gospel, 1 Corinthians 15, and he leads into this creed. Whenever the gospel is defined, it basically is the deity, death, and resurrection of Jesus. That's a minimum. Sometimes other things are mentioned, but those are always there. Deity, death, resurrection of Jesus. So he interviewed those guys. Okay, so back to your question. How do we know this wasn't a legend? Because we have a saying, Paul basically got this from the horse's mouth. He got it from the person doing the talking. Who? Tell me again, who did he get it from? Well, first of all, he was an eyewitness. Critics think whatever his experience was, whatever you're going to call it, he had an experience on the way to Damascus that he believed was a resurrection appearance. So he got Paul. Then he talked to Peter, one of the 12, John, one of the 12, James, the brother of Jesus, who was an unbeliever, until he came to believe that he had met the risen Jesus. So in other words, he talked to the people, the very people whose lives were transformed and they were willing to die, and some of them did die. You go, well, people can be mistaken. That's right. That's right. People can always be mistaken. But Paul did the kind of research that you're supposed to do. He went to the eyewitnesses, interviewed them. And in 1 Corinthians 15:11, right after Paul does his creed, in 1 Corinthians 15:11, he's talking about the apostles who saw Jesus. And he mentions Peter, he mentions James, he mentioned himself. And he said, 1 Corinthians 15:11, he said, whether it is I or whether it is they, so we teach, and so you believe. In other words, Paul's saying, if you don't believe me, go ask Peter, go ask John, go ask James, the brother of Jesus, the big four. You're going to hear the same story. So the reason we know it's not mythology is that he interviewed the other three, he makes four, the four biggest named people, and he got their testimony. That's how you know it's not legend. And people don't die for a lie. They can be mistaken, but they don't die for what they know to be a lie. The message gets started on the right foot. And real quickly, the last three of my facts, the first one's crucifixion. The disciples thought they saw Jesus. They reported it very, very early. 4, their lives were transformed. They were willing to die for this. And then you got 2 skeptics, Paul and James, both of whom become believers because they thought they saw the risen Jesus. So those are the facts.
Yes,
he interviewed the eyewitnesses. And the last one, by the way, is the empty tomb. There's over 20 reasons to believe in the empty tomb. According to the way the critics count evidences, over 20 reasons. That's pretty strong evidence. Go right ahead, man.
That's what I wanted to emphasize. What you just said right there. Even though obviously we don't have time to delve into how many reasons or arguments or lines of evidence support each of these 6 facts. You're simply summarizing these facts. And I wanted to emphasize this, that when you say, well, Paul said so-and-so in 1 Corinthians or in Galatians, you're not just saying this is true because the Bible says it's true, or this is true because Bart Ehrman says it's true, but rather the reason why this stuff is credible and reliable, historically reliable, is because there are external evidences that support these things.
Correct.
Yes, these aren't just
correct.
claims.
If you took just the 6, what I call 6 plus 1, 6 plus the empty tomb. And by the way, the empty tomb has as many evidences as about any of them. But you don't have quite the same amount of critical support. I mean agreement. But the evidences are there, which is more important. If you take only those 7, 6 plus the empty tomb, I don't call a minimal fact, but if you count those 7, there are over 100 reasons, the way the critics count reasons, over 100 reasons for accepting those 7. That is heavy, heavy backup. And remember, this is the ancient world. We didn't go down and buy the New York Times yesterday or go buy a book that just came out on the New York Times bestseller list. These are times when we don't have that kind of research, and still we know that we've got the data there for them.
Yeah, and then that leads me to another question. Then when we talk about these 6 minimal facts and all of the lines of supporting evidence, is this how history is done in general, ancient history specifically? Is the evidence that you have or that we have for these 6 facts, is it, how do I ask this? The criteria that you use to establish the truth or validity of these 6 facts, is that the same criteria that is used for other historical events, or is this something that is simply used for the Bible? Can we know these 6 facts on the same lines that we can know other facts of ancient history?
That is the way you do historical investigation. And I think the best example of that is that Paul was himself an eyewitness, and yet he made 2 trips to Jerusalem to talk to Peter and James the first time, and Peter, James, and John the second time. So he was doing research by going right to the people and interviewing them and getting their testimony to these things. That's how you find these things out. That, you know what, if you were a detective and you were investigating a murder or something today, you would go and find out. You wouldn't interview somebody who wasn't there. You'd interview somebody who was there. And then you would say things like this: well, how do I know you're not lying to me? How do I know you're telling me the truth? How do I know this or that? And there's all kinds of historical rules. You could say, well, I'm this guy's best friend, and I'm still telling you what I saw. Or you could say, I'm this guy's enemy, but I'm still going to admit that what he's saying is true. So we have other rules, like what best friends say, what enemies say, what kind of eyewitness data do we have? Do alternative theories? It's like, well, you say you were there. Sorry, Manuel, I interviewed somebody who said you were 200 miles away when that happened. You entertain other theories to see if there's any truth that your witnesses are not truthful. And that's how you get back up on the resurrection.
Okay, so when it comes to a historical claim, I guess something written, such as the New Testament gospel,
Right.
what are maybe one or two major criteria that are used to verify the reliability of these sort of claims as it comes to
Well,
ancient history?
Sure. Historians and New Testament scholars alike have what they call criteria. And these criteria are not foolproof, but they're the best ways to get research. And I just mentioned some a minute ago. If you have eyewitness material, eyewitnesses can be wrong, and yet it's probably our most famous kind of evidence in a court of law. So eyewitness is important. Early is important. You go, well, eyewitness is early. Not necessarily. You can have an eyewitness who's telling the story 60 years later, and they were there, but that's not early. So you want an eyewitness, early. I gave two other examples. An enemy who says, hey, I don't like this guy. I can't stand this guy, but I got to tell you something. He's telling the truth. I was there. Or then you got an eyewitness who is an enemy. Now you got two reasons to trust this guy. Now, what if you say, I'm his best friend? Well, yeah, now you could be prejudiced if you're his best friend. However, the benefit you bring is that you know how the person thinks and blah, blah, blah. Here's some reasons. There's a lot of other things. Here's one of the strongest arguments. Multiple independent sources. For example, the first fact I mentioned was the crucifixion of Jesus. Here's Bart Ehrman, who's an atheist New Testament scholar, and yet Bart Ehrman comes up with 15 independent sources for the crucifixion of Jesus. 15 independent sources for the crucifixion of Jesus. And a number of these are not even in the New Testament. A number of them are not in the New Testament. And some of them are non-Christian. And so, if you get non-Christian sources, if you get sources that come from other angles, so you got this fact right here, and the evidence comes in like this from different angles, multiple data, but multiple sources are very important. I could go on. There's many other rules. Another rule is the Gospels were back here. The New Testament is written in Greek, and yet Jesus' language was Aramaic. And so in the Gospels, there are places where the Aramaic is used, like when Jesus refers to God as Abba, very personal name for his father. Scholars think that where the Aramaic is used, that is an example of where the church thought it was so important that they actually preserved the words of Jesus. So now an Aramaic root would say, we may be getting back to the originals here. Here's another one. Jesus is on the cross, and he says, Eloi, 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 lama sabachthani. My God, why have you forsaken me? Well, that's another rule, because another rule is like embarrassing. Man, that is embarrassing for the Son of God to ask why his Father let him down. That's embarrassing. And it's also in Aramaic. So now I got two reasons to believe that saying. Jesus is troubled by what we call the problem of evil. But I have Aramaic and I have embarrassing. That is really odd for the Son of God, who claimed to be the Son of God, to say that. So those are some of the reasons that come up to back up these facts.
Yeah, so to reiterate and summarize before moving on then, there are certain criteria that are used for historical claims and historical events. And using these same criteria to these 6 facts, you reach the conclusion that, yes, these 6 facts are reliably true.
That's correct.
That's essentially
That is correct.
Okay, so now how do we get from these 6 criteria, these 6 facts, to the resurrection? I think that's the most important part. Does
Well,
this point to the resurrection?
you get those 6 facts together. Then I added the empty tomb, so it's 6 plus 1. You have him. You have the man dead on the cross. You have the disciples thinking they saw him later. If I went to your funeral and I stayed long enough to see the casket put down on the ground, it's not likely that I'm going to see you in the supermarket tomorrow buying a loaf of bread. Now, let's say your buddies, we play cards every Friday night, whatever. We get together for a football game on Monday Night Football. And it's Monday, and we're getting ready to sit down for the game. And 4 or 5 of the guys and I are in the supermarket, and we're getting some bread, for sandwiches. We're getting some soft drinks. We're getting chips. And we turn around, and you're there. That's amazing. We buried you yesterday. And the guys are getting their phones out, and they start photographing. Now, they didn't have photographs in those days, but my point is, that's the importance of eyewitness testimony. They were surprised. They didn't believe when they first saw Jesus. They didn't believe when they saw you in the supermarket. They didn't believe your buddies. And we all know you don't have a twin brother. So we started asking you questions, and we know you have a scar on your right hand from a hunting accident, let's say. And go, give me your hand. And you put your hand out, and man, there's a scar there. But here's the incredible thing. It's healed. It's healed. And you were buried 48 hours ago. So you start putting puzzle pieces like that together. And I guess the question would be, well, I didn't believe dead men would rise, but how am I going to explain you? And I go back, and the earth isn't churned up where they buried you. You can put this together. And by the way, I said a minute ago, the guys might get their phones out and take pictures. I said, we don't have pictures. But you know what? This is just an aside. If the Shroud of Turin, and I don't say it has to be the burial ground with Jesus, but if it is, there are a lot of people. One of the earliest studies on the Shroud, the conclusion of the book was the image on the Shroud could be a photograph of the resurrection of Jesus because it looks like an X-ray from a dead crucified body. I'm not saying it's true. I'm not saying we have a photograph. I'm not saying, Habermas is crazy. He thinks we have a photograph of the resurrection. I'm just saying it's possible. So even in the example of we saw you in the supermarket and somebody took a photo of you, could be analogous. Here's another one. Let's say it's rainy and we track mud into the supermarket and there's mud on the floor. And people are wondering if you're a ghost. And they look down at the floor and they say mud. And then they look on your shoes and there's mud. Well, guess what? If you think the shroud is Jesus's, the man in the shroud has dirt on the bottom of his feet. The dirt has been analyzed chemically. It's even been published. The results have been published in a peer-reviewed secular chemical journal. And the limestone, the limestone on the bottom of the man in the shroud's feet is limestone from the Jerusalem area, even though the cloth has not been out of Western Europe, as far as we know. So there. I mean, I know these are funny little parallels, but there's like a half photograph and there's a half muddy feet kind of illustration. So things could sort of build up to this, and that's how you build a case. And when you have and you could say, well, resurrections don't happen, and I'd say, well, what is that? Just your country or your family, or where did you get this? Well, most intelligent people today don't really. Well, Craig Keener has written a huge 2-volume work on miracles around the world today, and he reminds us the view that there's not another world, the naturalism, that is not a majority view in the civilized world today. It's a minority view. So a lot of people believe there is another world. And so that shouldn't even be the end of the line. Anyway, my whole point is you can put a puzzle together by bringing more and more pieces in. And I think that's what Paul tried to do. He made 2 trips. He went out of his way to come to Jerusalem to interview the eyewitnesses. And his testimony, 1 Corinthians 15:11, which critics believe he wrote, he says, they're all teaching the same thing I am. We all saw the risen Jesus. So we got a really good foundation here for a resurrection teaching.
So what I'm taking away from this is that all of this falls in line with what you would expect if the resurrection were true. Is that correct? Is that one way of looking at it?
By the way, that's another test. That's called coherence. If this did not hang together with what you would think, that would be a reason against agreeing with it. Like if you said, well, yeah, but you said something in that story which is never done in first century Jerusalem. Never done. You just made that up and you just disproved your own story. No, coherence means everything comes together, and it can be. Bart Ehrman has a test that if the Greek from the New Testament cannot be translated back into Aramaic, Jesus couldn't have said that. Now, you could have paraphrased it, but if it can't be translated back into Aramaic, Jesus couldn't have said it. So that's called coherence, and that's another test of whether these things are reliable.
Okay, so another way that I've heard these minimal fact arguments laid out is, I guess, pointing to the best possible explanation. So essentially what I want to ask is, are there other possible explanations that are equally or more likely than the resurrection?
And I would say, good luck. Let me give you an example. I know we're not deciding based on head count, but decades ago, naturalistic theories. Here's the naturalistic theory. Jesus didn't rise from the dead. What really happened was fill in the blank. That's a naturalistic theory. They were a lot more popular decades ago. I think people are realizing today, Emmanuel, that we have a lot of data, and these data points refute these naturalistic theories. And so today, the younger scholars, the up-and-coming New Testament skeptics, I don't care if they're atheists, don't care if they're agnostics, don't care if they believe some other religion, but they're scholars. Most of them do not choose naturalistic theories, which tells you something. Doesn't mean they're wrong, but if even the critics who wish there were a naturalistic theory doesn't want to choose them, that's an indication there's probably something wrong with those major theories. By the way,
yes, go ahead.
a number of them are in the New Testament. A number of those theories are thought up in the New Testament.
So this is something that already people were thinking of even in the first century.
Right.
Yes. So what is an example? One of the most popular alternatives, if there is one, to the resurrection. Because I know that even though this is the case, a lot of people simply nevertheless do not believe in the resurrection. So what other reasons could people possibly offer?
Okay, today among younger scholars, very few take these theories. But of the very few who take them, I've cataloged thousands of these views. Of those who take them, the most popular ones, still very uncommon against the whole, but one of the most popular ones is hallucination. They saw hallucinations. Here's a major problem. A lot of major problems. One of them is that tomb shouldn't be empty. I'll ask my grad students, is the hallucination theory a full tomb view or an empty tomb view? Go, well, it's a full tomb view. The body would be right back there in the tomb. It's not. And then you go, well, somebody could have moved it. Okay, now, but look what you've done. You've got hallucination and somebody moved the body. Now you got to prove two theories. But empty tomb is an issue. Here's the big one. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, Paul gives a list of people, the longest list of continuous back-to-back appearances in the New Testament. And he lists 3 group appearances. One to a group called the 12 apostles. One to a group called all the apostles, which is larger than 12. Could have been the women who attended with Jesus, could have been, others. And thirdly, the creed says he appeared to 500 at one time. I've got some buddies. One's a clinical psychologist, PhD. Another one is an MD. And they have checked the medical and psychiatric literature, the psychological, psychiatric, medical literature, and there is not a single documented account of a group hallucination. A group hallucination, hallucination is a private event. You're mentally ill, you're taking a drug that can cause hallucinations. You think you saw Bigfoot, but we went out there and checked, and it was a grizzly bear. There are other explanations, and people, when there's an image on your mind, obviously the image in your mind is not an image in my mind, and so group hallucinations don't work. And the problem with that, someone could say, well, let's just imagine there were one. Well, okay, let's imagine there are Martians. I mean, how far does this theory go? But okay, So what if there's one? Well, maybe there was one. Well, here's the problem. So the only group hallucinations we know from history, all of them happened to Jesus' disciples because they saw Jesus raised from the dead. It's not sounding like an hallucination anymore. There are a number of other reasons against hallucination. Matter of fact, on my website, GaryHabermas.com, I have a treatment of hallucination where I give 19 refutations. 19 refutations of one theory. So it might be the most popular, but it probably has the most refutations. But there's an example anyway.
Yeah, so you alluded to this, but I wanted to ask you nevertheless. What about people who say, well, does it have to be one explanation? Can I have one explanation for each of these facts? Like this fact can be explained this way, this another way. Does it have to be one that explains all 6 facts?
All right, well, here's the problem. That's like saying, I'll try to pick an example here. It may not be a very good one. But if you have to have whatever, a football game or whatever, where you need a bunch of things to happen just right for you to win the game. The problem is, we all know, to use football game for an example, we all know examples of things like the underdog. It looks like the underdog is going to win. I mean, they're just getting this together. They keep coming back after the other team scores a touchdown. A weird thing happens, a bounce of the ball, a fumble, interception, and it looks like they're going to come back. But at the last minute, the stronger team runs the clock out, and it's not an upset. The stronger team wins. What I'm saying is, when you're sitting there and you go, well, maybe for your 6 facts, I have 6 reasons. That means you have to have a bunch of things happen right in a row. And what's the likelihood that all of them are going to happen? And don't forget, that's not just 6 facts plus the empty tomb. So it's not just 7 things there, but each of those are facts because they're backed up by other things. So you might have to go after the things behind them. Mm-hmm. You might have to have 20 things happen right just to get those 6 facts. And it's not likely. See, in history, you don't prove things. You just say this or that is highly likely or not highly likely. And it's not very likely that 20 things are going to go your way, especially against the evidence. You go against the evidence, a resurrection is against the evidence, if that's your worldview. On your worldview, it's against the evidence, but not on my worldview. And I'm going to give you an example. I often say, well, what about near-death experiences? If near-death experiences happen and there's an afterlife, whoa, if people come back from the dead, from the scientific information we have today, then you can't tell me that Jesus coming back from the dead is impossible. A guy just wrote me one yesterday, and another guy wrote me one the day before, near-death experiences where people have witnessed some things that are incredible. But if there's an afterlife, that alone should keep you from saying, well, we know your picture of your worldview is crazy. No, crazy to you, not crazy when we get more evidence.
Okay,
it can be answered.
Yeah, so building off what you just said there about the afterlife, then I guess one of the final questions that I have here is it necessary to believe in God or in the supernatural in order for the resurrection to be a viable explanation? I guess there are people who discount the resurrection as a possible explanation by the mere fact that it is a supernatural explanation. That alone lowers the probability that it is true. How would you?
You know what? I heard just recently. There's a bunch of comebacks to that, but I just heard a really good comeback just a couple weeks ago. A book was published by probably the best-known atheist philosopher in the world, and he's making a case for atheism. And the book was reviewed by a Christian philosopher. And the Christian and the atheist was saying, my world is much simpler than yours. I just have a world where normal things happen. You Christians have a world where normal things happen, plus some abnormal things have to happen from the other world. And the guy reviewing the book said, let's just think about this. Let's think about who's got a troubled worldview and who doesn't. You naturalists, you think you only have a simple world and no other events. But on an explosion, on a big bang at the beginning of time, where time, energy, everything comes at the same time, all together. Okay, that's pretty strange, but let's say it happened. In a world where there's a random explosion, Here's my question for you. Why does it appear, as Richard Dawkins and many others say, why does it appear that this world is ordered? Why does it appear that this world has design? Why do the laws of math always work the same way? Why is 2 plus 2 always equal 4, as opposed to Monday, Wednesday, and Friday they're 4, Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday they're 3, and next week they're 1? On a random explosion, don't just assume that this worldview, you only have one thing and I have two. No, your world is incredibly illogical because you've got order, you've got fine tuning, everything has to be done just right. You've got laws of nature that always work. You've got laws of math. That favors my double worldview over your single worldview, because your single worldview is not a single worldview. You need your worldview plus something before it to make everything work. Now we both need something else. Now, why don't you refute my evidence instead of just, making fun of it? Why don't you refute my theory?
Yes.
I think that's a thoughtful comeback. You don't just have a world as a naturalist. The kind of world you have does not make any sense on naturalism.
Yes, I would agree with that. That's definitely a topic for another time, but definitely agree with that. I remember at one point, I'm not going to say this is not a direct quote because I can't remember exactly when he said this, but I'm almost certain that I once read Richard Dawkins say at one point that statistically, the likelihood of evolution to be true is very, very low when you take into account everything that has to happen in order for this to work out. But nevertheless, since we have the evidence, it must be true. So that
because it basically, because I don't like the alternative, my view has to be right, which is what we call a circular argument. In his book, The God Delusion, his very famous best-selling atheist book, he says really early, true, this world appears to be designed, but we know it's not. Well, that's just his presupposition. You can't just say, it seems like I'm wrong, but I know I'm right. No, why don't you prove your view instead of just assuming the other person's wrong? But he admits that kind of order. So I want to know, why are there mathematical rules? Why are there laws of nature? Why do things always drop under normal circumstances and go down to the ground? So in a world where we require laws, I have to ask where that law comes. Now, I'm not saying, I proved God. No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying you think you have a benefit by only having this bare world with no supernatural. You don't, because the world you need is not what would come from a Big Bang. It would not come from an explosion. Mm-hmm. So I think that's very important.
Yes. All right. So I believe I only have about two more questions that I have to go to bring this back to the minimal facts then. One question that is persisting in my own mind, and I know that a lot of people have this, is in what sense can I say that the resurrection actually occurred based on the minimal facts argument? Is it just probability, or can I say with any level of certainty, yes, this is likely, or this must have happened?
Bill Craig, he's not the only one. I participated in a book years ago on 5 views on apologetics, 5 ways of doing apologetic method. And they ask everybody, all these different views, they ask everybody 2 or 3 questions. One of them was, what is the role of the Holy Spirit in apologetics? And all 5 out of 5, now of course they were Christians, but you're asking the Christians about what they say about this question. All 5 of them said the Holy Spirit had a role to play in apologetics. Bill Craig says it this way. He says, there's 2 ways to know the resurrection happened. One is history, but if you're going to use history, you can only get what history yields, and that's high probability. You can't make it be more than high probability when high probability is all history can give. But he says the Christian who does not know history, the person who never studied history, doesn't know how to prove a fact, but if they're a Christian and they say, I have the testimony of the Holy Spirit, they have another reason, and according to Paul, the conviction of the Holy Spirit is something you know internally. Alvin Plantinga has a very sophisticated argument for how belief in God is properly basic. It's something we're all born with, and that's why the old saying, there's no atheists in foxholes. we all cry out to God. And by the way, if you're an atheist, very often when something happens to you or your family, you shake your fist at God. In other words, it's a normal response. So again, Bill would say there's two ways to get the resurrection, or Al Planiga. One is this properly basic notion that we have, which is not, it's not unsophisticated. I can't prove your mind exists outside of mine, and you can't prove mine exists outside of yours. But that's just something we work with, meeting people every day and saying, I've got good reasons for that. And Alvin Planick argues that God's like that. So, and that's certain. That's certain, he argues. So you got a certain view from God himself and a probable view from history on the data. So that's two ways you can know the resurrection.
Okay, and then I guess one final question then on the minimal facts argument. I don't know what other way to phrase it, but essentially what I'm asking is, what does it matter? So what? Especially for the non-believer. So I believe that apologetics is something that should be and is intimately connected to the gospel. It should not simply, it's not just some sort of intellectual exercise. Yes, it strengthens the faith of the believer, but it's also for the non-believer. So I believe that all of this discussion is ultimately meaningless if it doesn't have some application to the gospel. So I ask you, let's say the six facts are true, or they are very, very likely to be true, and the best possible explanation is indeed the resurrection of Christ. What does that matter to me? What application does that have to my life as a believer, or especially for a non-believer?
Well, let me give an illustration, and then I'll answer the question straight out. Let's say you were raised in a good home, loving parents, not perfect, but good parents, and you hope someday to settle down with somebody with whom to live and have a family. And we're best friends, so I introduce you to somebody, and you hate blind dates, but you'll do it because we're good friends. And you do it, and you date this person, and I'll say, well, what'd you think? Was I right? Yeah, you were right. This very special person. Can I be your best man? Well, hey, look, and you might say, you have a gap in logic here. I told you this is the neatest person I've ever met. I didn't say I was ready to get married. There's two sides to marriage. One is getting to know somebody and spending time getting to know them. Person's not very wise. We talk about going to a party or going to Las Vegas or going somewhere and waking up the next morning, you have a ring on your finger and you didn't have a ring when you went to bed. And you go, oh my goodness, what happened? That's not a wise way of dating. So you have to gather the facts. And then there's a part where you decide to say, I do, for better or worse, rich or poor, till death do we part. And you decide to follow. I think if the resurrection is true and Jesus is the one that is raised, let's deepen this a little bit. He said, it's my Father who's going to raise me from the dead. He said, you're going to be raised just like me. Almost 20 times in the New Testament, we're told we're going to be raised like Jesus. And why is that so strange when we have evidence for an afterlife today, like we've already pointed out? But you still have to say, I do. You can't be married without saying, I do. Got to say, I do, which is just shorthand for saying you got to make a commitment. You got to make a commitment to somebody. And I think that's what's relevant about the resurrection. Is it true? And if it is, and if you want it, and if there's an afterlife, then are you going to say, I do? Now, you might want to think about it. You might jump in with both feet right now. You might do something in 10 years if nothing happens to you. But, you know, it's commitment. And in the New Testament, almost every area of theology is said to be based on the resurrection. And most areas of practice are said to be based on the resurrection. So without the resurrection, I think Paul's trying to make the point in 1 Corinthians 15, 12 to 20. Without the resurrection, there's no Christianity. With the resurrection, you get everything. You get the whole thing. And so I think the bottom line is if Jesus is raised from the dead, everything we teach is true. And that includes the afterlife. Now, I started this interview by saying my doubt was framed by the two closest people in my life dying. Is it important to me that I would like to see my great grandmother someday and the mother of my 4 children someday? That's really relevant. And if I have that in my back pocket, so to speak, yes, I will see my great grandmother. Yes, I'll see the mother of my 4 children. That is really something for me to have in my back pocket. Now, I don't want to just have it in my back pocket. I want to be committed to a belief system that, we see the words in the New Testament, occupy until I come. We need to be doing something valuable. And you're doing it. You're having an interview today and you have a ministry and you're trying to help other people. That's what we do in the meantime. It's like, one famous skeptic said, it's not like there's a big event at the beginning and a big event at the end and nothing in between. What's in between is living life. And that's what we should be about.
Yes,
So that's a long answer to a short question. But the question is, I guess you could say, do we want to say I do to Jesus? And by the way, when I say I do to Jesus, you say, well, in the New Testament, in the Old Testament, God is called, in a marriage situation, he likens himself to the groom and the church, or in the Old Testament, Israel, to the woman.
Yes.
In marriage. It's interesting that that the New Testament talks in terms of a commitment. And I think marriage is probably the closest kind of talking we can get to commitment that we know in our languages.
Yes, and that actually could explain one of the main reasons for why so many people, even when confronted with the evidence, nevertheless do not believe, simply of the fact of they don't want to commit for whatever other reason they may have. Yeah,
Sure, and I can say to you, you're my best friend, but I'm not ready to get married right now. I'm going to wait for a while, and that's your choice.
Yeah, and I just as a comment on your answer to this question, the reason I asked the question in the first place is because I feel as though if this is true, if Christianity is true, especially the central message, which is the gospel and the resurrection, if this is true or not, it has serious implications both for this life and the possibility of an afterlife.
Absolutely.
And this is not something that should be, I believe I said this at the beginning of the interview, that it can't be taken lightly. It's not something trivial. And yet, a question of such significance, very few people actually take the time to ponder. Very few people take the time to study. It is something of such significance, and yet I live my life as if that didn't even matter. And that to me is very, very sad. Very, very
well
sad.
Said. No, very well said, Manuel. Very well said.
All right. So to close this out, then, I wanted to ask one final question, Dr. Habermas, to close this out. I mentioned William Lane Craig. You mentioned William Lane Craig throughout this hour that we've been speaking. Craig was very, very important to me in terms of my own conversion. When I was an atheist, I'm not sure I told you this story, but I was an atheist and I turned Christian through the study of the scripture, among other things. And William Lane Craig was one of the quintessential figures throughout that time. And he's been very prominent in my studies since then. I understand that you actually are friends with William Craig. Is that correct? So I just want to.
Yeah.
So I can't close the interview without at least asking this question. When can I meet him?
What was the question again?
When can I meet William Lane Craig?
Well, if you and I and he are in the same place and same time, I'd be glad to introduce you. But we got to be together, I guess, for me to do that.
All right, I appreciate
But
that.
I'd be glad to do it. I'd be glad to do it, and he'd be very friendly.
I can imagine. Hopefully one day that will happen. Well, Dr. Habermas, I just wanted to thank you for everything. I'm not sure if there's anything else that you wanted to say before we close this interview
No,
out.
I think you did a very good job. You started with the beginning. You took us through it, and that last question about what difference it makes all the difference in the world.
Perfect. All right, then. Well, thank you once again for this, this time that you're taking out to talk. I hope that this reaches a lot of people and that people have not been exposed to the topic of the resurrection and the evidence behind it are now, beginning this process thanks to everything that you've shared today. So I thank you once again. And I hope that, yes.
Glad to be here. You picked the greatest topic in the world, not just the greatest topic, but the greatest topic with the greatest implications in the world. And that's why Christianity is the center of, that's why the resurrection is the center of Christianity, because it does bring everything together. So we're focusing on the right thing.
Yes. So hopefully this isn't the last time we get to speak. But until then, thank you and God bless.
You're welcome.